So a few years ago, I was doing a project in Nicaragua with a couple of students, and during one of the breaks, one of the students came up to me and she asked me if I had a picture of my son. And I said, no, I don't carry a picture of him. And she looked horrified, as if I were a bad parent, and said, why not? And I said, why should I carry a photo of him? I remember what he looks like. This was not quite the truth. I do carry a picture of him, and I have for almost 15 years now. It's a blurry, fuzzy, underexposed Polaroid taken by a nurse about 1 hour after his birth. And I've carried this photo in my wallet, and I've never told anyone about this until this very moment in time. And it has survived thousands of miles of international travel. It's survived 3 job changes, 1 divorce, 2 almost successful attempts at pickpocketing. So the first time I saw my son, a thought passed through my head, which I assume that is similar to the thought that passes through the minds of any new parent who sees their firstborn for the first time. I looked at him and I said, man, that is one ugly baby. And he was. When he was born, he was what doctors called a micropreemie. At the time of his birth, he weighed 1.25 pounds. And in fact, his weight dropped under a pound after the first week of his birth. And I scrounged around in my pantry trying to find something that had a similar weight, and all I could find was a can of beans. That was how much he weighed. He looked like a little alien, a large, misshapen head on a small body that wasn't quite ready. His skin was scaly and translucent, draped over twigs that were posing as bones. And if they had let me hold him in the first 2.5 months of his life, I would have held him up to the light to see if I could see his skeletal structure shining through. And I tell you this story because I look at that photo often, and I wonder if this miracle, this alien baby that survived the conditions of his birth, will he ever become a leader of men and women? I'm not sure. And honestly, I don't think he wants to. We have a sense of what makes a good leader. In fact, there are studies which suggest that actually we all have a sense of what we want to see in the people who lead us. And this crosses national borders and cultures. We want our leaders to be inspiring. We want them to be good communicators. We want them to have a strategic vision of where they want to take us. And we also have a sense of what we don't want to see in our leaders. We don't want them to be asocial. We don't want them to be loners. We don't want them to be dictatorial in their leadership style. But I'm not sure that's actually what we want. Wired magazine, a few months ago, had a cover story of Steve Jobs. And it was a picture of Steve Jobs on the cover, depicted as both angel and demon. He had a halo and he had horns. And the text on it said, he was a Buddhist and he was a tyrant. He was a genius and he was a jerk. A few months later, the head coach of a National Football League team in the Midwest, after a particularly brutal loss, was speaking of his quarterback, who was a nice guy. And the coach went on a news conference and said, we need him to be a leader. We need him to be a jerk. We need him to be a real jerk. And he didn't use the word jerk. I hesitate to use the word that he actually used in the news conference because my son is sitting here. But is this what we're looking for? I'm not saying that we equate being leaders with being jerks. But I also think that sometimes we say one is an allowable downside to achieving the other. And this concerns me. This concerns me because my son is not a jerk, nor are my students that I teach and I send out into the world, as I say, release into the wild, right? My son is shy, he's reserved, he's occasionally unsure of himself, he detests the spotlight, but he's also wicked smart, a brilliant chess player who can see patterns emerge before anybody else and develop strategies to cope with that. He is generous, and he is still one of the kindest people I've ever met, like my students. So what does the future hold for someone like that? for someone who doesn't want to lead but has all the qualities of leadership that we want to see in our leaders. And I think out there are people who simply live their lives with joy, and as a result, influence and inspire the rest of us to be better people. These are people that we coalesce around because we unconsciously recognize that they have special qualities and that they don't realize it themselves. That every day they simply do what they love and have a ripple effect on the people around them. I call them inadvertent leaders. I'm going to tell you two stories. Two stories from my life. One is about a person I met a few years back, and the other is about a person I've known all my life and I love very much. So the first story. So a few years ago, I was trekking through the Kumbhu Valley in Nepal, as you do when you're having a midlife crisis, right? Trying to find myself. I was trekking up to the Everest base camp, and I had a guide with me named Ram, a young man, probably in his early 30s. And as you walk through the Kumbhu Valley, it is an amazing, amazing place. You pass by small villages, tea houses, monasteries. You see children giggling and running as they do all around the world, never having seen mechanized transport in their life, sunburned cheeks. And you see mountains, soaring mountains, amazing, amazing mountains. And every step you take is just another moment of glorious insignificance where you realize your place in the world and what you mean to the world around you. And at one point, when you go on this trek, above a small town called Namche Bazaar, you get your first sight of Mount Everest. And it's amazing. You find yourself catching your breath. Not because Mount Everest is a particularly impressive-looking mountain, but because of its history and its significance. And I stood there on that hill looking at Mount Everest, and I was taken aback. I was reflective. I was looking at something which, at least in my lifetime, was the closest the Earth would ever be to the stars. And I wanted to turn to my guide, to Ram, and say something poetic. I wanted to go all Walt Whitman on him, share this moment with Ram. And I stopped myself because I noticed the way he was looking at the mountain, a mountain that he'd seen scores of times before this. And he was staring at it meditatively, reflectively, peacefully, with a small smile on his face. And you knew, looking at him, at that moment in time, he loved where he was and what he was doing. Now, Ram was this amazing, shy, reserved, quick to smile, quick to laugh guide, Nepali guide. And whenever we went anywhere, everyone seemed to know him. He knew everyone in every village that we passed through. Whenever he would sit down, people would coalesce. People would come around him and sit and talk to him and find out what he thought about things. And they would laugh and joke and ignore me completely. And I don't think Ram ever actually understood the influence that he had on other people. He simply loved what he was doing, and he loved sharing that knowledge. And I'm not saying Ram was an introvert. I'm not saying he was reserved to the point of not wanting to interact, that he was a loner. He loved being around people. But he never saw himself as a leader and never was aware of the influence that he was having on the people around him. The second story I want to tell you is about my father. My father grew up in abject poverty in a small village in southern India. It was a small, dusty town. The school that he went to was makeshift with a thatched roof. They'd cancel classes whenever it rained. It was an amazing time in those days. He grew up in a village, and until he was 18 years old, there was no electricity in that particular village. To study, he would have to get a kerosene lamp and study under that. And my grandfather, who had only an 8th grade education, didn't see the point of spending all that money on kerosene and made him go outside and study under the lamps outside, the kerosene lamps there. In fact, my father still smiles when he tells the story of how his family took a big trip 30 miles away by a cart pulled by bulls to see an electric bulb that was in a village nearby. It took half a day, and it was a family outing to go see an electric bulb. Now, if all had gone according to plan, my father probably would have ended up as a clerk in that village. The name was Chintalapudi. And he would have become a small town, small clerk, just giving out stamped paper or writing forms for people who couldn't fill them themselves. But he was a geek, and he was an obvious geek. And the headmaster recognized this and sent him to a university with a full scholarship. He stayed at a poor students' hostel, which was essentially an orphanage. And he received a stipend of 2 rupees per month, which translates to slightly less than 2 cents in today's money. And this was the big city for him. And by the time he graduated with a bachelor's and a master's in zoology, he had ranked first in the university and received a gold medal from the president. After he finished there, he got a scholarship through the East-West Center to the University of Hawaii, and then moved from there and did his PhD from the University of California at Irvine before returning back to India, where he became a professor at the University of Delhi. And my father never saw himself as a leader. He never saw himself as somebody who could influence others or try to change directions for organizations or institutions. But I am still jealous of how much his students love him. I'm still jealous of how much his students take into consideration what he has to say, while he would just sit in his lab and do his research. He transformed lives without ever knowing it. He guided 12 PhDs, almost all women, who would normally have gotten married through an arranged marriage and had children and never gone back to work. And these PhD students are now full professors in Mexico. One runs a governmental program in Nepal for conservation. Another is a consultant in the Middle East for environmental programs there. These are the ripple effects of people who don't realize their influence, of what happens when you drop them into a pond, of how connected they were. The last time my father went back to his village, which was a few years ago, it hadn't changed. For the first time, they had gotten a real building with cement after 40, 50 years of him leaving the village. And when he went there, he was mobbed by school kids asking for his autograph, and he was stunned. But he was a rock star in that village. He was still the only person to ever leave that village for higher education abroad. These are the people who don't seek positions of leadership. They don't know that they're leaders. And I tell you these stories because we have to look out for them. We have to look for those people who simply have joy in what they do and as a result influence the people around them. That they are leaders unintentionally, inadvertently. And I'm not saying that the leaders that we train today don't have many of the qualities that I've been talking about. In fact, we teach it, we encourage it, right? Especially in business schools. We encourage these types of leadership studies of people who want to be leaders. But the time has come to also look at these thousands upon thousands of people in villages around the world. A village in southern India, a town in the mountains of Nepal, Rwanda, Bolivia. We need to look at these places and find people who live their lives with joy and influence the people around them and pull them into positions of leadership, because those are the people that I want to see lead our future. Those are the people that I want to have create a future for my son and my grandchildren. And so I look at this photo all the time. I look at this photo of my son, and I have hope, not for the miracle of his birth and his surviving of those conditions, but because I have hope for his reserved resolve, his quiet leadership, and that hope that someday somebody will follow him, and that unconventional, and perhaps not unconventional, but uncommon leadership becomes commonplace in the future. Thank you.